Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm talking with Will Beischel. Will is a doctoral candidate in the Personality and Social Context program. They received their BS in psychology from Loyola University Chicago with minors in biology and neuroscience. They're studying sexual and gender identity from a biopsychosocial perspective, with particular attention to sexual and gender minorities. I've been wanting to talk about some of these topics in terms of gender and sexuality with a variety of people. Will is absolutely wonderful. I found that talking with Will, I was able to make sure I could ask good questions and try to really understand all different sides of the spectrum in terms of gender and sexuality, and their perspective is really helpful, and I learned so much from the conversation, and so I'm really excited to bring you this conversation. We start out by talking about their background for studying sex and gender. We talk about sex configuration theory, talk about sexual orientation and its broader horizon. We talk about the three aspects of gender, sex, and then gender/sex. We talk about how the social environment interacts with testosterone and with power. We talk about interactions with the person and those around them. We discuss connections between the social and biological for gender and sex. We talk about what do we do and how do we best understand kind of the standard model of biological sex. We talk about brain development in utero, along with some genetics and how that's implicated with the variance with gender. We look at the roles of masculinity and femininity and how we can adjust them in the 21st century. And we end by talking about some of the issues that have arisen in competitive sports and the dialogue around that. I just want to say that, I say it in the conversation, I think it's super important to remember that many times people are having these conversations online. Sometimes they're having them in their communities. And I see some of these conversations where people kind of miss the person and they miss the humanity of folks. And that's something that I try to keep in mind always. I obviously don't get everything right, or, I'm trying to understand things as they're evolving and they're changing. And so I'm doing my part and doing my best. But I want, hopefully, that listeners will listen and say, how can I see the person here? How can I see the human here, and not, place folks in the middle of things for scoring points on one side or having different ways of thinking about things in these kind of abstract notions. We're talking about real people with, thoughts and feelings, and just like anyone else. And, I was really happy to talk to Will about all these things. They are just a wonderful resource, a wonderful person. And I was really happy with the conversation that we had. And so now I bring you Will Beischel. I am here with Will Beischel. Will, thank you so much for coming on and agreeing to chat with me. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Yeah. So why don't you tell listeners your area of study, your sort of kind of your career background, what you're doing, and what you hope to be doing in the next couple of years.
Yeah, so I'm a PhD candidate at University of Michigan in their psychology department. My area is called Personality and Social Contexts, which is kind of a catch-all area for a lot of different people interested in both the person, but also how they fit into social structures. So I study gender and sexuality. Sort of gender and sexual diversity is how I like to phrase it. Sort of all the different ways that people experience and identify their gender and their sexuality, paying attention to lots of different levels. The biological level, I studied neuroscience and biology in undergrad, and my advisor is a neuroscientist. I also am mainly my research focuses on sort of the psychology, the experience of being a gendered or sexual person, but then also taking into account society and the ways that our social institutions and ideologies shape the way that we can be and the way that we are gendered and sexual. So I use a lot of different methods. I do mixed methods a lot. So
Nice.
a lot of qualitative
Nice.
work, looking at, from people's own words, how do they identify and what are their experiences? And also some quantitative, trying to create scales and represent people's experiences in a more categorical or quantitative way as well. I'm in my 5th year of 6 years.
That's a while.
It's a long time. It was going to be 5 years, and then the pandemic happened, and then we were like, okay, let's extend it a year, which is a very good decision, I think. And yeah, so this summer I will be starting to apply for academic positions.
But
so
Godspeed, all the luck you need. I mean, I'm sending all the luck your way.
Thank you. Yeah, if you're familiar with that job market at all, it's a nightmare.
It's pretty ruthless. So all the luck I can send, man.
Thank you. Yeah. So just preparing both mentally and with my documents for that. Starting to do that now. But so my goal is to be a professor. That's sort of the dream, quote unquote. The reason I came to grad school, but I am also exploring other options because we have to these days as PhD students kind of have plan Bs and Cs, and I'm exploring things like user experience research in the tech industry or doing like nonprofit policy think tank kind of work. Or consulting, especially around diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. So just, trying to, I'll be casting a wide net, I think.
Oh, it's smart to do. That's great. That's all really great. What, I guess you don't have to go too personal if you don't want to, but what kind of got you interested in these topics and wanting to study them both quantitatively and qualitatively and to do it in your academic world? I know you said you got started in neuroscience, but what kind of interests you for the topics you study currently?
Yeah. It's definitely been a winding path to get here. Makes sense in retrospect, but in the moment it was always like, what am I doing?
Yep.
I'm sure that'll just continue to be that way.
That sounds about right. That's usually how it works for us folks, at least in the psych world and clinical psych. I mean, that was true for me too. It was like, I'm going to start out doing this. And I'm like, nope, we're going to take the long winding road, never the short and easy one. So that's sounds familiar. And a lot of my colleagues are same boat as well. So that's not uncommon.
Yeah, it would have been easier to know ahead of time, but we can't. So
right.
What are we supposed to do? So I studied neuroscience in undergrad. I did a lot of cognitive neuroscience work. So things like learning and memory using different neuroscience methods. And I liked it. I liked the research process. I liked school. I'm like obsessed with being in the classroom. And so grad school just seemed a natural progression from that. I got a lot of positive reinforcement from my academics and from my research advisor, who said like I sort of, am set up well for a career in this. I'm like, okay. But I got increasingly interested in more social questions rather than just sort of purely cognitive questions. Honestly, I got kind of bored with cognition. Like I wanted something that was a bit more had more tangible import in my life.
Sure.
And so I took queer theory my senior year of undergrad. I also took psych of human sexuality my second or third year. The sexuality class was terrible. Taught by a Catholic priest, which is interesting.
That is interesting. Huh.
Yeah, I went to Loyola, which is a Catholic school in Chicago. So yeah, I loved the textbook, and I loved like learning from that. The professor, not so much, but my queer theory professor was incredible, and was just like, it was just so cool to think about gender and sexuality in ways that I had never. And it kind of really blew my mind. And so when I was applying to grad schools, I kind of had like this scattershot approach. I was just looking at all the schools that I could see myself going to, and their faculty and what they were researching, trying to get a sense of like the varieties of research out there, and sort of settled on social neuroscience. I was like, oh, that's kind of the field I want to get into. And anyone who's studied something related to gender or sexuality is what I was going for. There's not many people doing that.
Yeah. So
I ended up broadening more out to like social identities in general. So some people doing stuff about race or other social identities. And then I thought I could bring this sort of my interest in gender and sexuality. And so through that process, I found who ended up being my current advisor, and Sarah Van Anders. She is absolutely brilliant and really just kind of has created her own kind of research that is really unlike almost anyone else's. She is a neuroscientist. She studied hormones, and especially she basically invented the field of social neuroendocrinology. So our social environment and social behavior's effect on hormones, especially things like testosterone. And then after grad school, she really branched out in thinking about gender and sexual diversity kind of more broadly. And she published a paper a few years ago detailing her theory of sexual and gender diversity called Sexual Configurations Theory, SCT. And it was just brilliant. I still remember like being on the train in Chicago, coming back from my job and reading it, and just like every paragraph just like blew my mind. You know, I was just like, wow, I didn't know that this kind of research existed in psychology, that you could study things this way. So it really solidified. I was like, okay, I think I want to work with her. Like, she's just so brilliant. And so, yeah, sort of a lot of my thinking around these topics comes either directly from her or her ideas, or come from our conversations together, either through our writing together or just our conversations. So yeah, and so when I came to work with her, I thought I was going to be doing like neuroscience, but in my first year, I was trying to flesh out a first project that I wanted to do. I really wanted to work with SCT, but there was not much work on it, and so I kind of did a project that was aimed at using this theory, which contains these 3D diagrams that people can use to describe their genders and sexualities in really nuanced ways. Using these diagrams in an online survey, so that we can get hundreds of people to fill out these diagrams, kind of show composite heat maps of where people might lie, and also demonstrate that people could do this, that the diagrams are pretty complex, but we could teach them how to use it and get really rich data about people's, and I focused on the gender diagrams. There are 3 different diagrams on gender, sex, and what we call gender/sex, which is sort of a composite of both gender and sex. Yeah, so that project really got me interested in gender, sex, diversity as like a main topic of interest. And then that kind of shaped the rest of my grad school career. So it's really that like first main project that showed me I was really interested in gender diversity, in thinking of ways to represent that diversity in psychological research in a sort of like bottom-up approach from people's own words and experiences. And I was like, there's so much work to do with that, so much interesting work to do with that the neuroscience stuff kind of fell out. And I'm like, maybe that'll come back one day, but I've just got really invested in like, how do we even talk about and represent all of this incredible diversity that we see in gender in a field of psychology that likes to sort of name and categorize and quantify.
Oh, that's your story is really compelling. I mean, it's at least the way you tell it is you kind of how you start, and then how you kind of stumble into something, and then it leads off from one branch to another branch to another branch, and then here you are. So that's great. That's really great, and I can see and hear the kind of passion you have for it. So it's always really nice to see people that feel passionate about whatever topic or research area. So maybe we can start then, I guess, with that is maybe explain to us the theory that you read on the train, and explain to us the ins and outs of it. I'm sure you obviously know it, and then we can start kind of branching into some of the diagram things you mentioned and everything else about biological sex and gender and et cetera. So maybe that's maybe a good starting point to kind of start there.
Yeah. So sexual configurations theory is okay. I see it as it makes a lot of conceptual interventions, and then it also contains these diagrams. So I'll talk about the conceptual interventions first. So one of them is that when we talk about sexual orientation, often we're talking about, people assume you mean, are you gay? Are you straight? Are you bi? And that's about both, those terms are both about both the genders of the people you're attracted to and your own gender, right? Are they like the same? Are they different? Mm-hmm. So that is one aspect of sexual orientation, but Sari's contention is that, we can be oriented towards all kinds of things, not just towards what gender are you attracted to. So one of the pieces in the theory is partner number. So you can be oriented towards having one partner, multiple partners. Also, the theory disentangles nurturance and eroticism. So nurturance sort of being like warm, loving feelings of, relationships or sexuality. And then eroticism being, about physical aspects of like tantalization and physical pleasure and orgasm and those sorts of things. And interestingly, that distinction comes from neurobiology. So those two systems have different, pretty distinct neural and biological underpinnings, the nurturance system and the eroticism system. And another one of Sari's theories kind of lays out the hormonal aspects of those. And so, people might be oriented towards having one nurturing partner, but multiple erotic partners, for example. Mm-hmm. And so there are identities like polyamorous and other sorts of, and even asexual and aromantic, that talk about how many partners someone might be interested in having. Mm-hmm. So that's another aspect of sexual orientation that's not really conceptualized as much as sexual orientation. Mm-hmm. And so she sort of saw these two things together and were like, we want to decenter gender as the only thing that matters for people's sexual orientations.
Okay. So far, I'm tracking so far.
Okay, good. But yeah, stop me if anything's...
No. I'm tracking.
Okay. And then, so we have the nurturance eroticism distinction, the partner number distinction. And then she also distinguishes three aspects of gender and sex. So there's gender, and in our lab, at least, we talk about gender as social aspects, sociocultural aspects of femininity, masculinity, any sort of gender expression or way of sort of being that is social.
Can I use some stereotypes?
Yeah.
So if I'm a dude, I like sports and fixing cars and lifting weights, and that's masculine, I guess, in a traditional sense. And if the feminine is more stereotypes, right? I enjoy knitting, and I enjoy maybe reading, and I enjoy long conversations, talking about my feelings. Again, I'm using very, very traditional stereotypes, but something like that. Yeah, in terms of the masculine, feminine kinds of notions.
Exactly. So cultural notions of masculinity and femininity that are traditionally tied to men and women, normatively, but of course, anyone might experience masculinity and femininity, and also, define what that is for themselves. So a woman might have a short haircut, which might seem like masculine, but it feels feminine to her, right? So,
so subjective.
It's subjective, exactly.
Okay.
Subjective. So that it's the cultural notions. And that sort of comes from feminist theory about how gender is kind of the cultural aspects of kind of how we view men and women. Then there's sex, and that is physical, evolved characteristics related to femaleness, maleness, and sex diversity, so including intersex.
So this is genitalia and secondary sex characteristics?
Exactly. Yep. So hormones, sex characteristics, where do you grow hair on your body? Those sorts of things. And then there's the sort of unique category that Sari is a sort of a champion of, is this gender sex. So gender/sex is a term that she came up with to describe the sort of as an umbrella term of anything that is related to gender and or sex, but is maybe not super clear which one it quite falls into.
Can you give an example?
Yeah. So the identity terms under gender sex would be woman, man, sometimes like people who are gender queer or, transgender and cisgender often kind of are both gender and sex. So whole people and like whole identities are often a mix of gender and sex, and it's hard to kind of disentangle that, right? At the individual person level, like is someone a man because they have the cultural role of being a man? Or are they a man because they were assigned male at birth and have male sex characteristics and identify with those sex characteristics? For, I would say, a lot of people, it's both. It's some combination. And so gender sex allows us to talk about these characteristics or these identities that aren't easily sourced to either gender or sex. So it's sort of how we move through the world is often kind of a combination of what our bodies are like, how we view our bodies, how culture views us, how we fit into social roles of femininity and masculinity. So it's sort of a combination of that. And we have research in our lab showing that if you ask people to define the terms feminine and masculine, it's a lot of social characteristics, kind of like what you were talking about. Right. If you ask people to define male and female, it's a lot of biological characteristics and physical characteristics. And then if you ask people to define man and woman, they use a combination of both social and biological characteristics. And so that is more evidence that there is this kind of third category. And we kind of use it as an umbrella term. Like I probably use it more than either gender or sex, because I think like a lot of stuff is some combination in that saying that it is definitely either gender or sex, often we can't really say that. So Sayeri's work shows that testosterone, for example, is of course a sex-related hormone, and people sort of would source it to like, yeah, of course it's sex, right? But it also responds to our social environment and social behavior,
Mm-hmm.
and gendered social behavior, for example.
What's
So
an example of how testosterone would work or respond rather to social behavior? Maybe just as a
yeah,
example.
so Sayeri has a paper showing that wielding power over other people causally increases testosterone, actually, especially among women.
Mm-hmm.
So, if wielding power over others is a gendered behavior in our culture, which we argue it is, it's a masculinized sort of behavior. That's how our gender as a social construct is affecting a hormone in our bodies. So it's both kind of sex and gender, because our social environment is shaping how it is being, how it is circulating through our bodies.
So it's interesting. So I haven't heard this before. So I'm hearing it all for the first time. So I'm putting it all together in my head.
Yeah.
So with this piece, let's see here. So the traditional kind of standard model is that both males and females have testosterone and estrogen, right? But they have more or less of it. So obviously, if you think of males, they have they have a lot of testosterone and very limited amount of estrogen, and it's the reverse for women. It's kind of a standard model.
It's actually similar levels of estrogen.
Is it similar levels? Okay.
But
males has the majority of the testosterone.
Yeah.
So there's this. So you're making. So, and I hate semantic arguments. So I don't want to get lost in semantic arguments, because that stuff really gets on my nerves. I hate when people do that. But are you seeing are you defining power and, let's say, aggression as maybe different? So, or are you seeing them as synonymous? Because I would think many folks would say, well, testosterone has a lot of aggression, which can incorporate power, but then you could parse that out and say that there's different layers or dimensions of power, right? So power can very much be over something or over someone, but it could also be a type of, smart power or intelligent power. It's not always punitive and tyrannical and negative, although many times it is, but not always. I don't think it's inherently power in itself as a trait is negative or positive. It is. And so is the idea of, well, in culture and society, how that presents, how testosterone has a social component, is it maybe more of a kind of aggressive thing, or am I being too granular in my my semantic argument here?
No, I think that's a great question. And of course, yeah, power can mean many, many things and contains a lot. Because I was listening to, what's her name? Had the Power of Vulnerability.
Brene Brown?
Yes, Brene Brown, thank you. Her podcast. And she talks a lot about power over versus power with, or power to. And that those are very different things. In the study that I'm citing here, it was actually actors. They had actors come into the lab and learn these monologues that were there was a control one, and then the one that was wielding power was as a boss firing someone.
Okay.
So someone who's in a position of power, wielding that power over someone. And of course, like, bosses need to fire people. Like it's that's just how, maybe, we could set up a society in which that didn't happen. But
right.
it's not necessarily saying that like that is a horrible thing to do or that that's like problematic in and of itself. But it was that's the kind of power that
Sure.
responds to testosterone, or testosterone responds to.
Okay.
It also, testosterone also definitely responds to aggression and more violent behaviors. It's been shown that sports fans watching a football game, their testosterone level increases sort of as the game is going, and if
Probably
their team,
cortisol as well.
oh yeah, for sure. If their team wins, they have higher testosterone than if their team loses.
Yeah, it's that rush that that you get.
Right. Yeah, right. So there's this like vicariousness to testosterone as well, which I think is quite interesting.
So in the social part of this, right? So you're making or I guess the paper is making the claim that testosterone has this social component. So you're giving an example of like the boss firing someone, which is a kind of, I would say, general example. It's an example of how power over someone can be, or, with the position. I mean, I think that's fair. Or you're giving an example of like fans with their sports team and they win and all this rush of testosterone. So so make the link, I guess, for me a little bit more clearly about how the social components impact or interact with the testosterone, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the idea is that in our culture, men are conditioned and socialized to wield power over other people in a lot of different ways. I would say maybe like the more problematic ways, less problematic ways, but in general, men are often in positions of power. And so it raises this possibility that the way that we have structured gender in our society is interacting with people's hormone levels, in that really an intriguing possibility that one of the reasons why, if you just sort of go out and test people's sort of circulating hormone levels, a portion of the variance there between men and women isn't just it's genetically determined and so on, but it has to do with people's daily experiences, like wielding power. So if testosterone does sort of increase with these more masculine activities, then that is sort of evidencing this social environment pathway to affecting our biology.
So okay, I can follow the logic here. So so is it kind of I don't want to put words in your mouth, but is it one of these things where it's like, okay, let's say for me as a man, I have, I'm a boss or supervisor or professor or whatever. I have some position of power, right? Which again is in modern society, that's something that we've created. Obviously, positions are important, and they do have, and in the position itself, some kind of elevation in a way. So I think that's obviously fair. It's a social thing we've all created as a race. But if I'm doing that, I think that you could say, I guess what I'm trying to get at is that you can have, you're making the link that when there's a position of power, that there's a link in how it has changes within a person's body and with their testosterone, with their hormones. That's the link that's being made, right? Is that this action or being in this position or doing this can have an effect, and so there's the social components or within society that are impacting each person's endocrine system or their hormones. But let's say, so let me just give an example. Let's say I'm a professor And there's an element of power there for sure, right? Obviously, there's women that are professors, obviously, but let's say I'm a professor and I have, grades, and I have to correct people when they make mistakes, or, whatever. There's roles I have a professor have. There's a, kind of the appropriate pedantic kind of way. That's used kind of in a dirty word, but there's a appropriate way of doing that. I can do that in subjectively positive or negative ways.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I can be a shitty professor and just be an asshole, right? And just be that one that's like, I don't give A's, don't even try. Right. Like, I've had professors like that. Right. Just don't even try. No one's getting an A. Or, I could use my power, positionally, I guess you could say, in ways that are more, I guess you could say adaptive, or more for the well-being of students, et cetera. So encased with this idea of, okay, you are in a position of power, or you have power, over someone that can impact. Let's go with the argument. If it impacts the testosterone levels, you're not necessarily making a qualitative judgment. You're just saying there is an interaction. So it's not this is bad or this is good. I'm using that loosely. It's just this is kind of coming from a person, right? And then it's through the socialized context of, power, or, some kind of position over people. And so then when that bounces back for the person, it's kind of like this mirroring that's going on, right? The person is in the position, they're exercising whatever their duties are in some type of, power or positional platform. And then based on the environments that come back, that then impacts their testosterone, or is it just how that is for the person that's in the position of power that impacts testosterone in other people that they're around? So is it just with the person, or is it also with other people in the social context?
That's a great question, and I think that Sari would be the best.
Okay, fair enough.
To add a hormone expert. From my understanding, both do happen. So like with the sports example, if you lose, your testosterone actually goes down. So so I would imagine that the recipient of that, their hormones are getting affected in some way. Mm-hmm. And if we think evolutionarily, there's hormones sort of have this role of preparing the body for what's coming, right?
Yeah.
Activating certain systems in the body. Mm-hmm. And so we think that, that's why social behavior is affecting hormones, because it's preparing the body to then maybe take further action, or like sort of upregulating certain systems that are important to whatever you're doing. Mm-hmm. So definitely, I think there's a complex interplay between the sort of purveyor of the power, the recipient of the power, their hormones. It's all kind of interactive in a way. And what Sari's work kind of complicates is that actually most of the research has tried to look at the hormones to behavior pathway. So, and we have we have a strong sense culturally, I think, of that's kind of what hormones do. Like, someone's acting hormonally, or your hormones kind of like make you do something crazy, right? Like, that's kind of there is a cultural notion of that. Mm-hmm. It's interestingly, like, that link is much harder to find, and actually doesn't show up in a lot of cases. That naturally circulating levels of hormone are somehow radically affecting our behavior. Like, that's actually not kind of, it bears out in research. Like, either it's just that's not what's happening, or it's just harder to detect. What's easier to detect is actually our behavior's effect on hormones. So of course, there's probably some sort of complex feedback loop going on.
Yeah.
But yeah, the overall point is that if social gender structures our behavior, which I would say kind of obviously it does, And if that behavior structures at least partially what's happening in our bodies, it kind of creates this pathway in which social gender and biological sex are constantly interplaying.
Mm-hmm.
And that's that idea of gender / sex, gender sex.
So you're so with that, if I'm understanding right, the argument is then scaling upward pretty quickly there, because then it would be, well, we have one key component of what is not entirely male, right? But predominantly, males have high amounts of testosterone relative to women. So we can then scale up and say, well, there's this kind of interplay between gender and how we understand the social components of gender, and then how we understand biological sex. And then we can see this kind of how they intersect as one metric of understanding testosterone. I guess I guess comments on that would be, but there are many other, I guess, components of what makes traditionally biologically, men and female. So let's talk about biological sex then. Let's talk about that for a minute. So I think I'm really asking. I'm very interested. If you look in, social discourse, in our today, and if you go online long enough, you'll see people that are just very entrenched in these different kinds of camps about these things. So there's like the standard model, which is, there's men and there's women, and that's it, and this is what it is. And then you have, other camps that are, much more fluid with that, and will say, gender is a construct. I don't know if they would make the claim that sex and biological sex is a construct as well. And there's a lot of fluidity there. And so do these things have to be in opposition? How do you understand this kind of, how do we understand some kind of first principles about what biological sex is, and then how that does or doesn't interact with kind of the socialized aspects of gender? How do you kind of understand that?
Yeah. So one issue in thinking about this is the term biological sex, I think, holds a lot and means a lot of things. First of all, to scientists, biological sex is kind of redundant, because sex kind of means biology. Mm-hmm. But people use that term biological sex to mean sex assigned at birth, often. Mm-hmm. And so what's lost there is that biology is incredibly flexible, right? So, for example, and people, bring up this term in debates around kind of who counts as a man or a woman, for example. And people will say, like, trans women are biologically male. Mm-hmm. So that's the other. So not everyone would agree, or find. I know definitely there are trans women that would say, I am biologically male and I identify as a woman. But I would say that that's actually in the minority, and that a trans woman is biologically female, because like I said, biology is incredibly flexible. So a trans woman who's been on hormones for a year has basically identical levels of sex hormones as a cis woman. They have female sex characteristics, whether that be secondary or primary. They, move through the world as a woman. There's just very few senses in which saying that that person's biologically male even makes sense. So I sort of, even at an empirical scientific level, not even taking into account someone's sort of own conception of themselves. So that's one way that sort of biological sex is misused, because there's not that incorporation of the flexibility aspect. People kind of think that if you're assigned male at birth, you have XY chromosomes that sort of just determines your sort of biological existence for the rest of your life. And we know that that's just not true. Through people who transition and intersex people and so on. So, and then the other aspect is that male and female are not just biological terms. They are social terms as well. People use them to mean social categories of woman and man, much to our ire as scientists, because we like to have everything be in neat boxes. But of course, people use these terms in all sorts of ways. So saying someone's a trans woman is biologically male just contradicts her own identity and her own experience of herself. Lots of trans women will say, like, I have a penis and that penis is female. Like, that is my experience of my body. So I tend to work from, think from the margins and think from the most marginalized, and their ways of our ways of thinking about bodies and social roles, and kind of listen to their account of their bodies and take that very seriously. And my advisor Sari had a series of tweets about how the phrase biological sex gets used in all of these, basically usually in regressive ways, and to restrict people's rights and to discriminate. And she's like, if you'll notice, she's like, people use the biological sex card to kind of like restrict bathroom use and access to healthcare and sports, which I know you're interested in. And she's like, if you'll notice, the biological sex card is the BS card. It's often used in ways that both are politically regressive, but then also just don't reflect the actual science. So that's my view of that term. And in sex in general, I view it as, I do view it as a social construct, but people often don't quite understand what that means. Not saying that there's no material reality, no biomateriality. Like, of course, people have different bodies, and that tracks. There is such a thing that some people call 3G sex, genetic, gonadal, genetic, gonadal, and why can't I think of the third one? It'll come to me. That is fairly dimorphic in the human species, although not totally. There's overlap in every trait that you could possibly imagine. But there is variation in sex characteristics, right? There's a spectrum, and every characteristic that you could think of. And so the way that we splice and dice kind of who counts as male, who counts as female, which characteristics convey femaleness and maleness, are influenced by social forces. And that has been shown. Anne Fausto Sterling has a great book called Sexing the Body, in which she makes that argument very cogently, very compellingly. For example, when a baby is born and a doctor announces it's a boy or it's a girl, is based on genital appearance. That's the only thing it's based on, right? That's the only external characteristic at birth that is different. And, there's literally like a ruler in people's minds. If it's less than 1 centimeter, it's a girl. The sort of the external genitalia, so the clitoris.
Mm-hmm.
And then if it's more than like 3 or 4 centimeters, then it's a boy, it's a penis. Mm-hmm. But of course, there's like times when it's quote unquote ambiguous. And so mm-hmm. the ways that we as a society have dealt with that has differed across cultures, across time. So in those ways, like defining these terms is a social process. And in that sense, it is a construct. But of course, a construct that is very much speaks to materiality, our bodies, and social constructionists of sex do not deny that and are very cognizant of it. So yeah, there's almost nothing about our bodies that is untouched by society, is how I kind of like to put it. We know our bodies through these social lenses. But we as scientists, we can kind of define certain things in certain ways. And we're defining sex as this, but just knowing that there's not like, there's no edict from the heavens that says like, this is how to divide all of these things, right? It's sort of an ongoing process.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's very helpful. You explained that very well. I mean, I was able to track with it, and that's very helpful at least for me, to understand some of the ideas and perspectives here on this. So going to, I guess, back to biology. So my understanding is, and it's, I think, what probably most of us were taught for, either in undergrad or maybe in high school or whatever, was that I don't know if it's the sex differences are entirely based on chromosomes, and not even necessarily genitalia per se. My understanding is that you have gametes, and that the gametes are almost always put into a large category, and then there are gametes that are into a small category. And this happens from an evolutionary model through natural selection. And we can see this in most other species, other mammals. And, if you take that we're in an evolutionary world, and, we're social primates, we're part of nature just as much as anything else. We're a living organism just as much as anything else, multicellular living organism. And so there are other, in nature all around us and what we observe, we typically see, larger and then smaller. And typically when there is any intermediary, it's less chances of being viable, although it can happen. And so it's, from what I understand, there you have two gametes, and they will develop and generate into what we understand as this sexual dimorphism of male and female, and that it mostly has to do with the process of how that works internally. So there's the matching of most of the time, not always, but most of the time, because obviously there's intersex folks, but most of the time there will be the internal genitalia for a man, penis, testicles, and for a woman, ovaries, fallopian tubes, uterus, and vulva. And so that is seen as male, female. And so that's before you get to hormones, that's before you get to chromosomes, that's before you get to even just the kind of what you're saying about the measurement, even just the observation of external genitalia. My understanding is that because there's basically these two categorizations of gametes, that internally, even for folks that are some folks that are intersex, there's an internal structure of their genitalia, and sometimes the external genitalia is not in alignment with that, I guess is the way you could say it. So that's my understanding of kind of the standard model of how we get to sex in terms of male female and kind of sexual dimorphism. I mean, nothing of what I'm saying is is from Page News. I mean, this has kind of been kind of just the boring biology textbooks for years and years and years. And so you're saying that that's, well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you're saying that that's not quite accurate, or it's not true, or what's tell me the problems of the gametes and of sex as we know it. How have we been getting it wrong, or how do we need to update it, or what is your kind of I guess approach for that model?
Yeah, so one thing to know, and to note, and you probably know this, but sex differentiation in utero is an incredibly complex process. It's not just like one switch and then it's a cascade of biological events, and it actually is controlled for the most part by chromosomes. So the zygote, the fertilized egg, is either XX or XY,
right?
And as the fetus is developing, depending on that genetic configuration, it triggers different cascades of events that then affect fetal development into either the male typical or female typical pathways. Somewhat largely controlled by the Y chromosome, although that's also a lot of work has been done to complicate that. It's also sort of other chromosomes are involved in that process. Which then, so they say a male typical developing fetus will develop sort of proto-testes, which then start producing different levels of hormones than sort of proto-ovaries, as well as other structures, but which then affects things like the appearance of the genitals, whether they're more internal or more external. And so there's a sense in which the genetics really are kind of the main driver of sexual differentiation.
It's the engine.
It's the engine, exactly. The conductor, even, maybe.
Yeah, right, there you go.
Of this very complex,
organism.
Process.
Yeah.
So at each stage, so that things can go the sort of typical route or not, and so that's where a lot of intersex folks, they're somewhere along that route. Something is different than the typical pathway. There is like the brain is also developing as all of these things are developing.
The neural tube and everything. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Right.
So one of the theories, and it's not fully supported, but one of the theories of where we get gender identity is as the brain is developing in utero with all of these different hormonal milieus, the brain is also exposed to these different levels of hormones and might predispose someone to as they're developing outside of the uterus as a child, start to think of themselves, identify themselves either as a boy or a girl. And as one potential influence, of course, not determinative, and not the only influence, but one potential influence on some people's sense of their gender. So I say that to also kind of, again, complicate this clean division between gender and sex. If sex hormones are influencing the developing brain, which then influences how people see themselves later in life in a social way, that also is kind of a fun, interaction between society and biology. So that's the general kind of pathway that we see. And I remember 3G is genetic, gonadal, and genital. 3G sex, which tends to, I think, about 98 to 99% of humans have a 3G sex, which can be seen as male or female. But that does not mean that person will come to see themselves that way.
Yes.
So that's another sort of differentiation, and one that is obviously much more cultural, because we have all sorts of gender systems, across cultures and throughout history. But yeah, I do think that there's something, social constructionists often kind of don't give biology much power. I do think that there's something going on with our developing brains that might kind of predispose us to see ourselves in certain ways, to look at our culture and be like, I'm like these people, I'm not like these people. Also to view our bodies in certain ways. And that as we're developing, kind of, there's work with trans kids showing that they self-socialize. So a trans girl might has almost an identical gender psyche if you compare her to a cisgender girl. Even if that girl was raised, as a boy, as most of them are, for at least a period of their lives. So there's like a self-socialization going on where a developing child is looking at the social world around them and seeing like, oh, boys are like this, girls are like this, women are like this, men are like this. Where do I fit into that? It seems like a lot of kids know somehow intuitively where they fit into that. In both trans and cis kids are like, I am socializing myself as a boy or as a girl, depending on what I am sort of being called towards or what I am identifying with, which I think is a really new research area, and I think very, very interesting work that kind of teaches us about gender development across all people and how that works. I know that was a bit of a tangent, but
no. That's great. I think it's, again, you have a very nice way of kind of talking about this stuff and explaining it. So no, I was tracking with you. So it's very, very, very helpful. I do want to get to the sports thing, because I know that's also an ever-present discussion. But I guess my question that I've always wondered about this is, and you tell me what you think about this, is, the first part that when you were talking about kind of the theory, what was it? Remind me again of the theory.
Sexual configurations theory.
Yeah, I think that there's really some merits there in terms of, for 50,000, 100,000, however long we came, evolved from our common ancestor, and there was 4 types of humans on the planet at the same time and all that stuff. But Homo sapiens and how we are and how we've been living, we've had these ways of understanding sex differences and gender roles and all that stuff for thousands and thousands of years. I'm not putting a qualitative value judgment on it. I'm just saying that that's how we observe anthropology. That's how we observe history. Okay, fine. But I do wonder, though, if when you're talking to folks that are kind of buy this model, right? If you go out to I just pick on folks here. If you go out to Middle America, right, and you just say, guys do this and women do this here. I wonder if there's a larger conversation to be had of saying, well, how can we look at the roles or the ideas of masculinity and femininity as a continuum, right? Like there's nothing inherent about, again, I'm going to just pick on stereotypes. A guy can wash the dishes and, do the laundry, and a woman can change the oil and cut the grass. Like there's nothing inherent in those, again, socialized things, right? That we say, I don't think it's wrong. I will say this. I don't think it's wrong if people do that, or if they abide by a traditional set of gender roles. Like, okay, fine. Okay, you're not harming anybody. You're promoting people's goodwill. Okay, fine. But I do think it would. I would be curious to see if we had a more healthy and appropriate conversation or dialogue as a society of like, look, men and women can do what they like. And it doesn't mean that they're less of a man or more of a man or less of a woman or more of a woman. Even if you're still sticking with that, standard model of male female, even within that, the ideas of what we understand as masculinity and femininity, I think are important discussions to have. Take for example, I mean, in our field and clinical psych, for me, I'm always the minority, right? That's women do this field, right? For the most part, or women are highly dominate, social work or nursing and things like that. And again, I don't think that's a good or a bad thing necessarily. But I don't think that it's wrong or it's a feminine job or something like that. I mean, these are kind of antiquated notions, I think, of understanding how we cohabitate in society. So, I wonder if at the very least there is some space, and that's why some of the aspects of the theory that you were describing, I was like, yeah, it really comes down to how we're conceptualizing and what our taxonomy is of some of these ideas in terms of masculine, feminine, male, female, those types of things, which I think has at least some, I think it's deserving of consideration by many people to say like, yeah, maybe we can update some of this stuff for the 21st century at the very least. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
So many thoughts. I would love to see an update. It's interesting. There are different ideas about, so I'm teaching at my own course right now called Queer Psychology, which is really fun. And one of the
I'm gonna audit that course. I'm gonna jump in. I'm gonna audit the rest of the semester.
Yeah, please. It's so fun. It's been great. It's online and actually it's working out really, really well. But one of the questions that I like to pose to my students is, what do we do with gender? Mm-hmm. Like we can see the problems with it, I think, pretty clearly. Mm-hmm. But like, for example, I agree that there's nothing inherently wrong that like men tend to do this, women tend to do that. If those different roles were valued equally in our society, which they are not.
Yeah.
And also if people didn't feel forced into those roles. Yeah. So I think it's pretty obvious that gender is pretty prescriptive. So you kind of can't opt out of the gender system. Like, it's not for me. You still like operate within a gender system, even if you have a non-binary gender or agender identity. Like gender is all around us. So I would like to see gender being less prescriptive as to what you can do with your life. Mm-hmm. And I think that's exactly what you're saying. Like, mm-hmm. It shouldn't be determinative of the types of careers you have or the kinds of the things you do as a parent, for example. I think that gender has taken on enormous meaning in our culture. Like I think about, you started talking about sort of our evolutionary history. Like there are a few evolutionary physical biological facts. Like men on average have more muscle mass, especially in the upper body, than women.
Yep.
And women, gestate babies and feed babies through breastfeeding.
I think it's men can also lactate, but it's very rare.
Very rare.
I could be wrong on that, but I've read that somewhere, and I don't know the veracity of that statement. But yes, I mean, traditionally, women have a uterus, they carry a fetus, they lactate, they breastfeed, etc. Men don't do that.
Don't do that, and tend to have it's a pretty stark difference in upper body strength on average,
yes.
Of course.
Yes, even down to like the muscle fibers and how they're working at a molecular level, and then the amount and the volume is just, and then you look at that in terms of muscles, and then also typically shoulders.
Yes,
even if you disregard body type for the most part, bone structure and how we are as social primates, there is a distinction between men and women in the upper body, both in bone and muscle fibers.
Yeah, exactly. So for those, those facts or those features of our bodies, might determine some things like who gives birth and who might be well equipped to go hunt down a woolly mammoth or whatever.
That's right. Yeah. I'll be honest. I always tell my wife and other women in my life that my aunts and my my grandmother and my mom, and just like, man, I'll tell you, the one thing is such a man thing, to kind of say. My mind was blown away. I don't know if it was Lamaze class or something, but my mind absolutely shattered in a million pieces when it was like the woman's pelvic bone literally moves significantly, through, if you're having a natural birth, for the birth canal. I mean, my mind was blown. I was like, that's like the very core of your structure, of your skeletal system. I was like, it shifts and it moves. I was like, that's insane. Like, no way. And I was like, yeah, I would never sign up to have a kid. That's insanity. Like, no, thank you. And I was like, there's much more respect for just physically. I mean, all the other things of like, of what it means, motherhood and things like that. It's like, man, you guys are champs. Like, couldn't do it.
Yeah. People who give birth, that's like a heroic feat. I totally agree. Someone who will never give birth, I can only just respect,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But, those things used to be, I would say, much more important. In terms of, if you think about like the percentage of a human life in which those matter, it's not that much, like, especially in a modern context. So we've like gone from those few kind of on average biological differences to now like pink is for girls, blue is for boys. Like, it's so far removed from where it's sort of evolutionary history, our gender systems in our modern culture. So it's sort of like not even on an unstable ground. It's like there's no ground on which that stands. So those sorts of systems, I think, they do harm. Like they do harm in their prescriptive nature. That as a person who grew up quite gender nonconforming and is still quite gender nonconforming, like, I know firsthand the ways that our genders are policed and the ways that our gender system is forced on developing children and adolescents and adults. And I can't help but view that negatively. Like, that's not what I want for our culture. So we might think that, like, if men tend to do this, women tend to do that, like, that, seems kind of benign, but I think it has pretty toxic origins. And I would love to see us moving past it. And, if we got to some future society in which everyone was treated the same, literally, like gender was no longer, besides, who gestates and who doesn't, for example. Right. Then if we saw that, like, oh yeah, women should tend to this, women should that, I'd be like, great, okay, that's fine. But we're not there. And so, yeah, I tend to think that we need to kind of strip away the prescriptiveness, the policing, the surveillance of gender. But at the same time, like in the queer community, we like love gender in certain ways, like gender expression, gender freedom, gender creativity. It's a source of a lot of pleasure, and that's kind of my dissertation is on gender pleasure in the ways people experience very rewarding, positive things from their gender, and from there's a lot of communal aspects to gender, like a lot of community building, a lot of just expression and freedom that can come along with gender, especially gender that's removed a bit from the prescriptiveness, from the binary. So yeah, I think that we have a long way to go, and it's where thinking about this is where I think feminist theory, queer theory, trans theory can all come together and really synergize in a way that I appreciate, because sometimes those things are at odds. But going towards a future in which gender doesn't mean as much, doesn't determine so much of your opportunities in life, what's expected from you, how people talk to you, how people treat you, so on and so on. So I would love to see us kind of strip away that, and keep the fun parts of gender. Like I like painting nails, for example, is like a very fun activity. I wouldn't want to take that away from anyone. But I think that being determinative of things like careers, of social roles, of parenting roles, and so on, like we can work as a society to strip away some of that.
Yeah, I think the way I'm hearing it is that, which I think definitely can agree with the spirit of it for sure, is you don't want gender to be descriptive or prescriptive of things, but descriptive, right? So maybe there are, like you're saying, like maybe there are some aspects that are that's a descriptive analysis, right? That, women, lactate and they, give birth, and men don't, but men have other aspects of them that are like, there are maybe some aspects with us in terms of our piece of our biological makeup that can be a descriptive factor. That's fine, but not that it's, and so now because of this, you can or can't do some of these things. So I can see the descriptive and less prescriptive, which I can definitely, I can hear that. So let's just talk about sports. So this is a tough one, and we're not going to cover everything on this, but I'll just cut right to the heart of it, which is I always get really nervous actually talking about this piece of it. I'm kind of nervous about all of it, but definitely this one, because it is the debates around this stuff do become pretty prescriptive, but I think on some sides there's a reason for it. But I get really, really upset and frustrated when people forget the humanity of people, and they forget to deal with these things with compassion, because because anybody that is doing anything is they're trying to. The world of sport has so much to offer, I think, and so many positive things. And so when people start talking about groups of people or other people, and they miss the humanity and they miss the compassionate elements, I think that moves us 10 steps back and not where we need to go. So I try my hardest. I don't get it always right, but I try my hardest to do that because I feel that. But so kind of what you're saying, if there is a woman that transitions, excuse me, if there is a man, so as assigned at birth, and there's they transition to a woman, and they decide to or want to do competitive sports in women's sports, many feminist groups and many many women have a problem with that, not because they haven't there's the legal stuff and the social stuff and their identity stuff aside. I think there's a lot of women that I've talked to and that I've known, they don't have any problems or any issues with them transitioning, none of that. I think the concern becomes over the specifics of it, as no matter how much of the supplements or the hormones that you're taking, like you can't change muscle fibers, you can't change the body and bone structure completely. And that makes it very difficult and sometimes can feel less safe for women, not physically per se, but more, this is our space. And I think where that runs into a problem is if this person is saying, I'm a woman in all aspects and everything is aligning up, but now there's just, I can't do something in a space for women, that is hurtful. That is, I think, probably unintentional. I don't think anyone, maybe some people, I don't think anyone intends to discriminate, but it does have that tone of it. So how do we, and correct me if I have the kind of just the general calculus of it wrong, but I mean, what do we do with this? How do we, what are your ideas? What are your thoughts? I think you have one paper where you've kind of written about this, but what are your thoughts? Am I getting the kind of overview right? And then how do we sort of navigate this?
Yeah, I definitely think you're getting the overview right. I would say that you're very generous in your analysis. I think there actually is quite a bit of trans antagonism going on, where people really just don't see trans people as their affirmed or identified gender. They see trans women as men. But I think that, yes, there are also lots of people who are just like, live your life, be who you are. It's just unfair in this competition with pretty high stakes, like for
you're talking about world records and winning certain medals, and you mean high stakes in that way in terms of the competitive? Exactly. Yeah. So like athletics is an important source of girls and women's social latitude. So like in terms of like scholarships and awards and things like that. So I definitely want to be sensitive to that. I'm of the mindset that we should always sort of start from the most marginalized perspective and try to structure our thinking in our institutions with their experience in mind. And yeah, I think you touched on like how shitty would it feel if you're a girl or a woman, you've been living your life that way, like sort of, everything about you as a woman, and then you're just told, because of the way you're born, you can't do this thing that other women can do. You're not allowed in this club. You're excluded. You can maybe play with the men, but that's like horrible, right? Like you would not. Yeah.
I think a lot of women would not want to be the only woman in a men's locker room, for example.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people could relate to that. So then it's like, oh, so you just can't do this thing at all. Like that can't be our solution, right? So when, you know, when trans people are so victimized in our culture and oppressed and discriminated against in so many other aspects of their lives. And sports can be a very important avenue for community building, for finding your place, for anyone.
Yeah, certainly.
And so to deprive that of someone, I just don't think that we can do that. So then, I think starting from there is helpful, because it leaves out certain possibilities that do the most harm. So, for example, there are states, I think Idaho or something, passed a law like that they cannot, that trans people cannot compete or be in competitive sports with the gender that they identify with. Mm-hmm. And so that is just to me, just obviously not the path. Right. And that can't be the thing that we do. So
how do we fix it? Fix it for us, Will. Fix it.
Shockingly, I don't have a magical answer. If I did, then I think I would become famous and rich.
Yes, you would be on many of the late night shows, and you would be on many conferences as a plenary speaker and all that.
Right. So if there were an easy answer, it would have already been figured out. Right. So I think one of the things is we're going to have to be more creative. And that's what that's what I really appreciate about taking gender diversity quite seriously, is that it allows us to think of how to structure our social institutions in different ways. Because we've had this men and women compete differently for so long in different, in different leagues and whatever. So it might ask us to think differently about how we separate sporting. And I've seen people think about boxing, for example, and wrestling, they have weight classes. Mm-hmm. Rather than just saying all the men and all the women are together. Mm-hmm. So we can start to think. I just attended a social psych conference, a virtual conference, and part of it, they try hard to do things that a conference would do just virtually. And so one of the things was a 5K. You just do it on your own, and you have a smartphone or a smartwatch or whatever to track your run, and then how long it took, and then you submit that to this and then there are prizes for people who do it the quickest. And what they asked is and I was I was pleasantly surprised at the progressiveness of this. They asked, do you feel that you're that you should be, I forget the wording, but that you be in a competitive realm with sort of men or with women. So it wasn't, are you a man or a woman? It was where do you feel you should be in terms of competitiveness? It was something like that. It was worded actually better than I'm saying. Mm-hmm. So it was more with your just assessment of fairness, where would you place yourself? So I think there are small things like that we could do. So one thing is that people have argued, and my advisor Sari has argued. She was actually an expert witness in the in one of these cases. I think it was Dudi Chand was an Olympic runner who is a woman, and she's not trans, but the people were accusing her of being intersex in a way that gave her special sort of advantages, having sort of they call it hyperandrogenism, sort of too high levels of testosterone for being a woman, even though that's not actually a condition or something like medically recognized.
Right.
So she was an expert witness in this. And then, we wrote that paper on biological sex, gender, and public policy and how to sports segment of it. That there is, so in competitive sports, there are all sorts of things that are not fair.
Yeah.
So, and some of them have to do with your body, and some of them have to do with your social environment.
Or your wallet.
Exactly, right. So if you grew up with a personal trainer since you were like 5, like,
right.
And so on, there's all sorts of things that aren't fair about competitive sports. So the fact that there's just so much fervor around trans women competing with women as an unfair advantage, like, I would like to see it couched in kind of a bit more level-headedness, I guess, of like, well, there are all sorts of things that aren't fair about people's natural sort of gifts that they were given by their biology. There's research also to show that, like, I know that some trans women friends of mine who are athletes, when they started transitioning, like, saw a pretty big reduction, at least at first, in the things that they could do physically. And so I think now that's kind of where a lot of people are going, is like, if you've sort of been on hormones for like a year or something, then you're sort of at levels of
so some sort of a temporal component, right? This is some of the time piece of it. So you're not going to do it, when you've been on hormones for 3 months, but maybe 12, 18 months, 24 months, or something like that.
Right. One of the things that I think about with this issue is the issue of scaling. So, like, often with trans issues, the scale gets blown way out of proportion. So the number of trans athletes that are like winning all sorts of competitions is like minuscule. Tiny.
Very tiny.
And so much public and social fervor around an enormously small number of people. So there's like this massive anxiety around something that's like not actually that big of a problem. And, what if we took that anxiety and like made it more productive in terms of how girls are treated as potential athletes. Like, so few girls are encouraged to even try sports, much less try to be very competitive in them compared to boys. And like, what if my advisor, as I said, most of my ideas come from her. He's like, what if we view, so like, boys who like are bigger and often like have more fat are often like seen as having pre-muscle, like, oh, they're gonna, be like linebackers or whatever.
Right.
Not always, but like there's more of that. But like a bigger girl, like, is not seen in the same way. And so I think that that affects so many people. And so that inequity is so pervasive, whereas the quote unquote inequity of trans people like out competing athletes of the same gender is like such a tiny proportion. So I'm like, there's always this, there's always this like boogeyman kind of, or this like this like anxiety that trans people are just gonna like overtake women.
I hear
And
that. I hear
I
that.
see that happening. Also, there's lots of stories like trans people have been competing in sports for decades. Like it just hasn't been as public because a lot of times in sort of our American history in the past century, trans people transitioned, moved to a new city, adopted a new name. No one knew. You know, it was called stealthing. Or passing, and that was often like the narrative that we know happened. And so there actually have been lots of trans athletes in sports, and we didn't even know. So trans people have been competing in sports for a long time. It's just now there's this sort of public scrutiny that to me outweighs kind of the actual material, what is happening.
I can hear that.
Yeah. So I don't think that there's going to be a solution in which that like everyone's happy with.
Sure.
I know that the girls who lose to trans athletes like are pissed. Like that's who is bringing these them and their parents and coaches are bringing these lawsuits and these like these cases to court, which then sort of has these effects on trans people. So yeah, I same thing with like the bathroom bills and such. Like trans people have been going to the bathroom for a long time.
Right.
And that's happened. So so I often think that these debates get very theoretical and very hypothetical in ways that don't actually reflect the reality of what's happening. You can find cases that, yes, trans athletes like are killing it, but it's just such a small number. So I hear
that.
I think we need to, kind of be, again, like more level-headed about like, what is the scale of the problem? My advisor also makes the point that like the sports that we have were created by men. And so they're of course going to rely on sort of the biological things that like men tend to be good at. And it's like, what if we had sports that women are better at than men? What if we like create those? Obviously that's pie in the sky, kind of, doesn't really solve the immediate problem, but that's also something to think about.
Right. Well, look, Will, I mean, you have been very generous with your time, and I definitely want to respect it. So I'm going to try to have these hard conversations. And I know that you do good work, and you're very, again, honest and level-headed, and you seem very balanced and just quite kind. So I think that we need folks like you to keep doing that. So I appreciate you. Tell listeners where they can find your work, or where they can find you online, or the best ways to kind of see your stuff.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll sort of just echo that it is hard to have these kinds of conversations in ways that don't sort of devolve. And I think this format is a great way to have those instead of, on Facebook or these places where it's hard to have an in-depth conversation with someone really has best intentions. So this has been a joy. You can find me on Twitter. That's sort of my academic professional presence. Just my name, Will Beischel. And I post my research there. I post my random thoughts on usually different issues related to gender and sexuality. So you check me out there. You can check my Google Scholar page.
That's always nice to have one of those.
Yeah, it feels great. I have some articles and more coming out.
Wonderful.
on gender diversity, especially. Yeah.
Yeah. No. Well. Again, I could keep talking to you for hours and hours. So I really enjoyed all the things that you shared and you taught me and entertained my questions, and just a really nice, lovely dialogue. So I appreciate you.
Thank you.
All righty.